The dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the grimy window of the parish archive, illuminating a single leather-bound ledger. Its cover, cracked with age, bore no grand title, no gilded inscription, only the faded ink of a date 1933. Within its brittle page it count so meticulously detailed, so dispassionately recorded, that it chilled the blood in a way no Gothic tale ever could. It was the chronicle of what some whispered was the cruelest exorcism ever recorded in U.S. church archives, a testament to faith warped and humanity irrevocably broken. Our story begins not in the hallowed halls of a cathedral, but in the desolate, sun-baked landscape of rural New Mexico in the year 1933. The Great Depression had cast its long, gaunt shadow across the nation, and here, in the isolated settlement of Santa Maria de la Soledad, its grip was particularly tight. This was a place where time seemed to move at a different pace, where ancient traditions clung to the parched like the tenacious desert scrub. The community, a small collection of adobe homes clustered around a modest church, was bound together by shared hardship and an unshakable, albeit often fearful, devotion to the Catholic faith. At its heart stood Father Thomas Vargas, a man whose stern countenance and unwavering piety had earned him both respect and a certain distance from his flock. He had arrived in Santa Maria de la Soledad almost 2 decades prior, a young priest fresh from seminary, filled with an ardent zeal that the harsh realities of the desert had slowly tempered, but never extinguished. The parish itself was ancient, its foundations laid by Spanish naries centuries ago, its walls whispering stories of forgotten trials and whispered prayers. Families like the Reyes, the Garcias, the Valdezes had tilled this unforgiving soil for generations, their lives intertwined with the rhythm of the church bells and the unforgiving cycles of drought and sparse rain. They were simple folk, their lives a constant struggle against the elements and the economic despair of the era, yet their faith was a bedrock, an immutable truth in a world that offered little else in the way of certainty. It was into this crucible of faith and hardship that the inexplicable began to seep, slowly at first, like water through cracked adobe. The history of Santa Maria de la Soledad was, in many ways, the history of struggle. The early missionaries, driven by a fervent desire to spread the word, had encountered a land both beautiful and brutal, inhabited by indigenous peoples whose own spiritual beliefs were deeply rooted in the land. The blending and often clashing of these two worldviews had left an indelible mark on the region, creating a unique spiritual landscape where reverence for the divine was often mingled with a profound respect and sometimes fear of unseen forces. Local legend spoke of ancient spirits of the land holding memories of places where the veil between worlds was thin. The church, in its attempt to firmly establish its dominion, had often incorporated or subtly reframed these existing beliefs, creating a syncretic faith that, while outwardly orthodox, held deeper, more complex currents beneath the surface. Records hinted at previous instances of unusual occurrences, of strange illnesses defying earthly remedies, of villagers claiming to hear disembodied voices or witness fleeting shadows. Most of these incidents had been dismissed by the various priests who had served the parish over centuries as mere superstition or the product of overactive imaginations. Yet, a faint thread of unease persisted in the collective memory, passed down through whispered tales and cautionary proverbs. The community, in its isolation, had developed a particular resilience, a stoic acceptance of hardship, but also a heightened sensitivity to anything that disrupted the fragile order of their lives. Father Vargas, for all his modern theological training, understood the weight of this history, the unspoken anxieties that simmered beneath the surface of his congregation's quiet devotion. He believed firmly in the divine, but also in the insidious nature of evil, a force that could manifest in the deepest recesses of the human heart, preying on vulnerability and despair. He saw it in the bitterness that could fester during a long drought, in the petty jealousies that could erupt into violence, in the gnawing fear of starvation that could drive men to desperate acts. He believed that the devil was real, not necessarily as a horned fiend, but as a corrosive influence that could slowly, insidiously, corrupt the human soul. This belief would soon be put to the most agonizing test imaginable. The problem began with Isabella, the youngest daughter of the Reyes family. She was a quiet child, barely 12 years old, known for her gentle demeanor and a pair of eyes that seemed to hold the vast, empty sky of New Mexico. Her family was unremarkable, hardworking farmers whose lives revolved around their small plot of land and the routines of the church. Initially, her symptoms were subtle, dismissed as the typical ailments of childhood, a persistent cough, a loss of appetite, a pallor that deepened day by day. But then the change became more pronounced, more disturbing. She began to speak in a voice that was not her own, a low, guttural rasp that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within her, a voice that spoke in a language no one in Santa Maria de la Soledad understood, yet filled with an undeniable malevolence. Her small body, once so frail, would contort into unnatural positions, her limbs that at angles that defied anatomy. Her eyes, those once sky-blue pools, would cloud over, becoming dark and vacant, or sometimes burn with an unsettling, ancient rage. The village doctor, a kindly old man whose remedies were often little more than tinctures and reassurances, was at a loss. He ascribed it to a fever, then a nervous disorder, then simply, mystery of the body. But the Rice family, and indeed the entire village, knew better. They had seen something like this before, or at least heard tales of it. Whispers of possession began to circulate, hushed and terrified, carried on the dry desert wind. Fear, cold and sharp, began to weave itself into the fabric of daily life. Children were kept closer to home, doors were bolted earlier, and the usual evening chatter in the plaza faded into an uneasy silence. Father Vargas, initially skeptical, attributed it to hysteria, a contagion of fear spreading through a vulnerable community. He visited Isabella, offering prayers and blessings, attempting to reassure the distraught Rise family. But as he stood by her bedside, witnessing the gross contortions, hearing the unearthly sounds that tore from her small throat, a cold dread began to settle in his own heart. This was not illness, this was something else entirely. The descent into the abyss was slow, agonizingly so, like watching a flower wilt in reverse, its petals blackening, its stem twisting into an unnatural knot. Isabella's conditioned, with each passing day, escalating in both its intensity and its disturbing manifestations. The guttural sounds became coherent, albeit in a language that twisted the familiar cadences of Spanish into something demonic and profane. She spoke of things she could not possibly know, intimate secrets of villagers, forgotten sins, ancient grievances that had long been buried. She would call out names of the dead, whispering their final moments, their last regrets, causing those who heard her to blanch and cross themselves. Her physical transformations became more grotesque. Her skin, once smooth, began to exhibit strange marks, livid bruises that appeared and vanished without cause, and at one point, what appeared to be faint, linear scars that seemed to etch themselves onto her flesh. The strength she exhibited was terrifying, often requiring several adults to restrain her when her fits of rage consumed her. Objects in the room would inexplicably shift, or sometimes fly across the room with violent force. A crucifix blessed by Father Vargas himself, once shattered into splinters when she merely gazed upon it with those dark, vacant eyes. The villagers, already steeped in a deep-seated fear, began to avoid the Rise home entirely, crossing themselves whenever they passed its adobe walls. They stopped bringing gifts of food, their compassion eroded by a terror that was too profound to overcome. The Rise family, once a respected part of the community, found themselves isolated, trapped within the walls of their home with a child they no longer recognized. Desperation gnawed at them, driving them to traditional remedies, local curanderos, and finally, back to Father Vargas, their pleas more frantic each time. Father Vargas himself was deeply troubled. He consulted his texts, obscure theological treatises on demonology, and recounted the few, sparse guidelines for exorcism found in official church doctrine. He corresponded with the diocesan bishop, a pragmatic man who initially dismissed the reports as provincial hysteria, but who, after receiving Vargas's increasingly urgent and detailed letters, began to show a flicker of concern. The bishop, however, was hesitant to authorize a formal exorcism, a rite considered exceedingly rare and fraught with spiritual peril. He instructed Vargas to continue with prayers and blessings, to ensure the child was receiving proper medical care, and to monitor the situation closely. But Vargas knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was beyond the realm of medicine. He spent sleepless nights in prayer, grappling with his faith, his training, and the horrifying reality unfolding before him. He saw the toll it was taking on the Reyes family, the mother, Blanca, withered and gaunt, her eyes perpetually red from weeping, the father, Matteo, his once strong hands trembling, his face etched with a despair that no harvest failure could ever inflict. He knew he had to act, even without the explicit, formal approval that the church so painstakingly required. He began to prepare, not only spiritually but logistically, for a battle he knew would demand every ounce of his conviction, and perhaps his very soul. The horror, when it finally descended, was not a sudden, cataclysmic event but a slow, suffocating suffocation of hope, a grinding erosion of what it meant to be human. Father Vargas, having received no explicit denial from the bishop, interpreted the silence as a tacit permission or perhaps a desperate plea for action. He began the exorcism rites in the small, dimly lit bedroom of Isabella Reyes. The air was thick with the scent of old adobe, beeswax candles, and the metallic tang of fear. The first session was a revelation of unspeakable evil. Isabella, once so frail, thrashed with a strength that defied her size, her screams tearing at the very fabric of the room, sounds that seemed to come from 1,000 throats at once. The voice, the demonic entity that spoke through her, was filled with a vitriol that blistered the air, taunting Vargas, revealing his own private doubts, his moments of weakness, his secret fears. It spoke of ancient pacts, of forgotten sacrifices, of a darkness that had long predated the coming of the missionaries. It claimed dominion over the land, over the very dust of Santa Maria de la Soledad, and asserted that Isabella was merely a vessel, a temporary dwelling. Vargas, armed with his crucifix, his holy water, and the ancient Latin prayers, fought back with a resolve born of desperation. He was a man of God but also a man alone, facing a force that seemed to mock the very concept of divine order. The exorcism was not a single event, but a series of agonizing sessions that stretched over weeks, then months. Each session left Vargas physically and spiritually drained, his voice hoarse, his body aching, his soul scarred by the vile pronouncements of the entity. Blanca and Matteo Reyes, their faces etched with a perpetual anguish, would often sit in the adjacent room, listening to the horrifying sounds emanating from their daughter's bedroom, their prayers a constant, desperate murmur. The entity seemed to delight in their suffering, its voice sometimes mimicking Isabella's innocent tone, calling out for her mother, only to revert to its demonic rasp, spewing obscenities and threats. The village, hearing the unearthly cries that sometimes pierced the quiet nights, kept their distance, their fear solidifying into a grim acceptance that Isabella was lost. Supplies for the family were left on their doorstep, quickly retrieved, a silent acknowledgement of the contagion that had afflicted their neighbor. During these sessions, Vargas observed chilling patterns. The entity seemed to draw strength from despair, from the erosion of hope. It would recede slightly when he was particularly fervent in his prayers, only to return with renewed malevolence when his own doubts began to creep in. It targeted Isabella's innocence, her childlike vulnerability, twisting her features into monstrous parodies of her former self. The most disturbing revelation came one sweltering afternoon during a particularly violent fit. As Vargas recited the litany of saints, Isabella's small body began to contort with such force that a low, sickening crack echoed in the room. Then, in a voice that was both Isabella's and yet utterly alien, the entity whispered a chilling truth. She welcomed me. She opened the door. Not to me, but to the despair that birthed. Vargas recoiled, his mind reeling. Had Isabella, in her innocent despair over the hardship of her life, unconsciously invited this darkness, or was it merely a further deception, a psychological torment designed to break his resolve? He pushed the thought away, focusing on the immediate battle. But the seed of doubt had been planted, a tiny, insidious worm gnawing at the edges of his conviction. The horror was no longer confined to Isabella's room, it had begun to seep into the very foundations of Vargas's faith, challenging his understanding of good and evil, of innocence and complicity. The ending, when it finally arrived, was not one of triumph or vanquishment, but of a quiet, chilling desolation. After months of grueling, relentless exorcism, a terrible stillness settled over the Rise home. The violent thrashing ceased, the demonic utterances faded into an unnerving silence. Isabella, gaunt and utterly spent, lay motionless in her bed, her eyes open but vacant. Father Vargas, equally emaciated and profoundly shaken, declared the demon expelled. The silence, however, was not the peace of a soul redeemed, but the hollow quiet of something irretrievably broken. Isabella never spoke again. She ate only when force fed, her movements listless, her gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. Her eyes, those once sky-blue eyes, remained clouded and devoid of all light, reflecting nothing. She showed no recognition of her parents, no flicker of emotion. It was as if the demon in its departure had taken with it every spark of her being, leaving behind only an empty shell. The Reyes family, devastated, clung to the grim comfort that at least the torment had ceased. But the victory felt utterly hollow, a bitter triumph over a greater loss. Father Vargas, though he had successfully completed the rite, was haunted by the outcome. He had saved her body, perhaps, from the clutches of a demonic entity, but her soul, her essence, seemed to have been irrevocably lost. He confessed to the bishop, in a letter penned with a trembling hand, the harrowing details of the exorcism, the chilling revelations, and the tragic state of Isabella. The bishop, in his reply, expressed a cautious relief at the demon's expulsion, but offered no true consolation for the child's condition. He attributed her state to the lingering trauma, to the fragile nature of the human mind under such duress. But Vargas knew it was more than that. He knew the cost of his battle, the true cruelty of an exorcism that stripped a soul bare and left it hollow. He continued to serve the parish of Santa Maria de la Soledad, his sermons now carrying a deeper, more somber resonance. He walked among his flock, a man marked by an experience few could ever comprehend, a silent sentinel to a horror that had left an indelible scar on the quiet desert community. Isabella Reyes lived for another decade, a ghost in her own home, a perpetual reminder of the dark forces that could inhabit the world, and the terrible price paid to banish them. Her unseeing eyes, fixed on nothing, reflected the vast, empty sky of New Mexico, a silent testament to a cruel victory, and a lost innocence that could never be reclaimed. And in the dusty archives of the church, the ledger remained, its faded ink preserving the stark, unvarnished truth of the cruelest exorcism ever recorded, a story whispered not in fear but in profound, agonizing sorrow. Father Vargas, irrevocably changed by the ordeal, found himself increasingly isolated not only from his flock, but within his own mind. The silence of Isabella, that profound, unnatural quiet, had become a constant presence in his thoughts, a chilling echo of the void he had confronted. He continued his pastoral duties, administering sacraments, listening to confessions, but the vibrancy that once characterized his faith had been replaced by a somber pragmatism. He preached of God's mercy, but his eyes held a shadow that spoke of a different truth, of a world where evil was not merely a theological concept but a tangible, consuming force that could leave behind only ash and emptiness. The villagers, while outwardly respectful, kept their distance. They saw the change in their priest, the haunted look in his eyes, and understood, on some unspoken level, that he carried a burden too heavy for them to share. They continued to fear the Rise home, a silent monument to what had transpired within its walls, a place forever tainted by the memory of the cruelest exorcism. Years passed, marked by the relentless sun and the occasional fleeting monsoon. The Great Depression slowly receded, replaced by the anxieties of a world teetering on the brink of another war. Yet, in Santa Maria de la Soledad, the scars of Isabella's ordeal remained fresh. She grew physically into a young woman, her body developing, but her mind remained locked in that perpetual, vacant state. Her parents, Mateo and Blanca, aged prematurely, their faces etched with a profound wariness. They cared for her with a quiet, enduring love, a love that transcended the absence of her spirit. They spoke of her in hushed tones, as if fearing to disturb the fragile peace that now existed in their home. They were no longer the vibrant, hard-working farmers they once were. They were guardians of a living ghost, their lives a perpetual vigil. The village children, too young to remember the full terror of the exorcism, knew Isabella only as La Silenciosa. The silent one, a figure of curiosity and mild apprehension, pointed out with hushed whispers. Older villagers would occasionally recount the tale, embellished and distorted with each telling, but always centered on the inexplicable horror that had befallen the Rise family. The ledger in the parish archive, once merely a record, became a testament, its pages turning brittle, its ink fading slightly, yet its chilling account remained, a silent scream frozen in time. Father Vargas, now an older man, his hair thinned and streaked with gray, found solace, or perhaps further torment, in his studies. He delved deeper into obscure theological texts, searching for answers, for explanations, for any shred of understanding that might reconcile the horror he had witnessed with the benevolence of God. He read accounts of other exorcisms, ancient rites, and modern interpretations, but none truly captured the unique, desolate cruelty of Isabella's case. He began to question the very nature of evil, not as a force external to humanity, but as something that could fester and bloom within the human condition itself, a seed planted by despair, by neglect, by the subtle corrosions of the soul. He remembered the entity's chilling whisper, "She welcomed me, she opened the door, not to me but to the despair that birthed me." That phrase, delivered in a voice both innocent and demonic, haunted his waking hours and infiltrated his dreams. Was it true? Had Isabella in some innocent, unconscious way, created the very vulnerability that the entity exploited? Or was it merely a further deception, a psychological weapon wielded by the demonic to sow discord and doubt? He found no definitive answer, only a deepening sense of dread that the line between human suffering and supernatural malice was far more blurred than he had ever dared to imagine. The annual Harvest Festival, a traditional time of communal joy and thanksgiving, took on a muted quality in Santa Maria de la Soledad. The songs were sung, the dances performed, but an underlying melancholy permeated the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the ever-present shadow. One sweltering August afternoon during the hottest part of the day when even the cicadas fell silent, a stranger arrived in Santa Maria de la Soledad. He was a tall, gaunt man dressed in a dusty black suit, his face obscured by the brim of a wide-brimmed hat. He arrived not by horse or wagon, but on foot, emerging from the shimmering heat haze of the desert as if conjured from the very earth itself. He carried no luggage, only a single, worn satchel clutched in his hand. His presence alone was an anomaly in the isolated village, a disruption to the familiar rhythm of life. He sought out Father Vargas, his steps purposeful, his gaze unwavering. He introduced himself as Dr. Elias Thorne, a researcher, he claimed interested in unique cases of psychological trauma in isolated communities. Vargas, though wary, felt a strange compulsion to engage with the man. Thorne spoke with a quiet intensity, his questions precise, his observations unnervingly astute. He seemed to know things about Isabella's case, details that had never left the confines of the Ray's home or Vargas's own private confessions. The priest felt a prickle of unease. How could this stranger know such things? Dr. Thorne's true intentions slowly, subtly, began to reveal themselves. He spent hours in the parish archive, poring over ancient records, his long, slender fingers tracing lines of faded Latin. He was particularly interested in documents predating the Spanish mission, indigenous accounts, and early colonial reports of strange phenomena in the region. He never explicitly mentioned the exorcism, but his questions often circled around unusual illnesses, unexplained disappearances, and local superstitions. He would speak with the villagers, ostensibly about their agricultural practices or the history of their families, but his inquiries would invariably drift towards whispered tales, old fears, and long-forgotten events. The villagers, unaccustomed to such sustained curiosity from an outsider, were initially guarded, but Thorne possessed a quiet charm, a way of listening that encouraged them to speak of things they rarely shared. He learned of a local legend, a tale of a sacred spring that had been desecrated by the early missionaries, a place said to be a conduit to the underworld, where ancient spirits of the land slumbered uneasily. He learned of a small, forgotten burial ground, predating the church, said to hold the remains of those who had died unclean deaths. Father Vargas watched him with a growing sense of apprehension. Thorne's interest seemed to extend beyond mere psychological research. It felt, to Vargas, like an archaeological excavation of the village's darkest secrets, a disturbing unearthing of things best left buried. He observed Thorne's unusual habits, his nocturnal wanderings, his intense, often unsettling gaze that seemed to pierce beyond the surface, and the way he would sometimes speak to himself in low, almost inaudible murmurs. The problem, once embodied by Isabella, now began to manifest in subtle, unsettling ways throughout the village itself, as if Thorne's presence had disturbed a dormant infection. A pervasive sense of unease began to settle over Santa Maria de la Soledad, a feeling that something was irrevocably wrong. Small, inexplicable incidents began to occur, tools vanishing from sheds, only to reappear in odd places, faint, disembodied whispers heard on the wind, shadows flickering in peripheral vision that vanished when directly observed. Animals, typically docile, became agitated, their barks and howls piercing the night with an unnerving frequency. The community, already superstitious, attributed these occurrences to the bad luck brought by the stranger, or perhaps the lingering effects of the evil that had touched Isabella. But Father Vargas felt a deeper, more chilling connection. He suspected Thorne was not merely researching. He was provoking. He recalled the entity's words about Isabella opening the door. What door, he wondered with a rising dread, was Thorne attempting to open now? The doctor's questions became more specific, more unnerving. He pressed Vargas on the exact details of the exorcism, the specific incantations, the physical manifestations of the demon. He seemed particularly fixated on the language Isabella spoke, urging Vargas to recall any fragment of its cadence, its sounds. Vargas refused, recoiling from the memories, but Thorne's persistence was unsettling, a quiet, relentless pressure that slowly eroded Vargas's resolve. The air around Thorne seemed to thicken, to hum with an unspoken energy. Children began to complain of vivid, disturbing nightmares that often featured a gaunt man with piercing eyes, whispering secrets. The subtle shifts in the village atmosphere mirrored a growing unease within Vargas himself. He felt a spiritual exhaustion he hadn't known since the exorcism, a sense of battling an invisible current, always pushing against him. The descent was no longer confined to a single individual, but encompassed the very fabric of Santa Maria de la Soledad. Dr. Thorne's presence, like a slow, acting poison, began to corrupt the quiet order of the village. The subtle incidents escalated. Objects didn't just move, they moved with malevolent intent. A crucifix on a villager's wall was found overturned, its base shattered. A small, handcrafted wooden doll, belonging to a child, was discovered dismembered, its tiny limbs scattered. The whispers in the wind became more distinct, taking on a mocking, taunting quality. People reported seeing fleeting, shadowy figures darting between the adobe homes at twilight, too quick to identify, too unsettling to dismiss. The fear among the villagers, once a dull ache, began to sharpen into a tangible terror. They started to eye each other with suspicion, their tightly knit community fraying at the edges. Old resentments, long buried, resurfaced, fueled by the pervasive anxiety. Arguments erupted in the plaza, fueled by paranoia and a desperate need to blame someone, anyone, for the escalating strangeness. Father Vargas, witnessing this unraveling, felt a profound sense of helplessness. He confronted Dr. Thorne, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. He accused Thorne of disturbing the peace, of stirring up old evils. Thorne merely smiled, a thin, almost imperceptible curving of his lips, his eyes glinting with an unnerving intelligence. He spoke of releasing suppressed energies, of unveiling hidden truths. He claimed that the village's deep-seated repression, its adherence to rigid dogma, had merely contained the darkness, not eradicated it. He suggested that Isabella's condition was not a possession, but a manifestation of these unacknowledged forces, a natural eruption of the land's own ancient memory. Vargas listened, his mind reeling. Thorne's words, though chilling, held a perverse logic that resonated with the priest's own creeping doubts about the nature of the evil he had confronted. The villagers, in their growing desperation, began to turn away from Father Vargas. His prayers, once a source of comfort, now seemed insufficient, powerless against the unseen forces that plagued them. They sought solace in old superstitions, in forgotten rituals, in whispered incantations passed down through generations. Some even began to visit the forgotten burial ground Dr. Thorne had shown interest in, leaving small offerings, hoping to appease whatever ancient spirits had been disturbed. The descent was complete. The once pious community was fracturing, consumed by fear and the insidious influence of a stranger who seemed to embody the very darkness he claimed to study. The horror that unfolded in Santa Maria de la Soledad was not a single, explosive event, but a slow, excruciating unraveling of sanity and community, orchestrated with a chilling precision by Dr. Elias Thorne. His research intensified, no longer subtle inquiries but direct, unsettling experiments. He began to gather certain villagers, often those already susceptible to fear and suggestion, and conduct what he called communal dream analysis. In the dead of night, he would lead them to remote, desolate spots, the desecrated spring, the forgotten burial ground, and guide them through visualizations, urging them to open their minds to the ancient energies of the land. The results were terrifying. The villagers began to experience shared hallucinations, vivid, grotesque ends of ancient rituals, of figures cloaked in shadow, of whispers in an unknown tongue. They described a pervasive sense of being watched, of something ancient stirring beneath the desert floor. The voices in the village intensified, no longer mere whispers but distinct, disembodied cries, sometimes mimicking the cries of a child, sometimes a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very earth. The physical phenomena escalated to a new, horrifying level. Small fires would spontaneously ignite and extinguish themselves without cause. Livestock were found mutilated, their bodies bearing strange, almost ritualistic marks. The most disturbing revelation came when several villagers, in their terror, began to exhibit scenery similar to Isabella's initial affliction, speaking in tongues, contorting their bodies and displaying bursts of unnatural strength. It was as if the possession was no longer confined to a single vessel but had become a contagion, spreading through the village like a virulent disease. Father Vargas, witnessing this horrifying replication, felt a cold despair settle deep in his bones. He realized, with a sickening certainty, that Thorne was not merely studying evil, he was cultivating it. He was a catalyst, a master manipulator, exploiting the latent fears and ancient beliefs of the community to conjure something truly monstrous. He was, in his own twisted way, conducting his own form of exorcism, but one designed not to cast out but to unleash. He confronted Thorne again, this time with a desperate fury. He accused him of spiritual malpractice, of playing God, of unleashing a pestilence upon innocent souls. Thorne merely regarded him with an unsettling calm. "I am merely revealing what has always been here, Father," he said, his voice a low purr. "Your faith, your church, merely suppressed it. I am liberating the truth." Vargas, however, understood the true implication of liberating the truth. It was a liberation not of spirit, but of chaos, of ancient, malevolent forces that preyed on despair and fear. He knew with a terrible certainty that irreversible acts had been committed, that the soul of Santa Maria de la Soledad was being irrevocably corrupted, and that the haunting consequences would far outlast his own lifetime. The true horror escalated to its crescendo when Dr. Thorne, using his insidious influence, convinced a small, terror-stricken group of villagers that Isabella Rise was not merely a victim, but the source of the renewed affliction. He twisted the entity's earlier words, "She opened the door," into a narrative of complicity, of Isabella being a willing conduit, a dark beacon attracting the malevolent forces to the village. His reasoning, laced with pseudo-scientific jargon and ancient superstitions, preyed on their raw fear and desperation. He argued that the previous exorcism had been incomplete, merely a temporary suppression, and that to truly cleanse the village, the original vessel needed to be purified, not of a demon, but of the very despair that had allowed the doorway to open. Father Vargas, hearing whispers of Thorne's dangerous pronouncements, tried to intervene, but his authority had been completely eroded. He was seen as a relic, a representative of a faith that had failed them, a man who had not truly saved Isabella but merely trapped the evil within her. The villagers, their minds twisted by fear and Thorne's manipulative rhetoric, began to turn on the Reyes family. Threats were uttered, stones thrown at their home. Mateo and Blanca, heartbroken and terrified, barricaded themselves inside with their silent daughter, knowing the inevitable was approaching. The climax arrived on a night when the desert wind howled like a banshee, whipping dust into swirling phantoms. A mob, their faces contorted by fear and fanaticism, gathered outside the Rise home, torches flickering in the oppressive darkness. Dr. Thorne stood at the forefront, his gaunt figure silhouetted against the flames, his eyes gleaming with a terrifying fervor. He called for Isabella to be brought out, for the purification to begin. Father Vargas, his heart pounding with a terrible dread, emerged from the crowd, placing himself between the mob and the Reyes home. He pleaded with them, his voice raw with anguish, reminding them of their faith, of their humanity, of the innocence of Isabella, despite her affliction. He argued that Thorne was a charlatan, a bringer of chaos, not salvation. But his words were swallowed by the rising tide of hysteria. The mob, whipped into a frenzy by Thorne's incantations and their own overwhelming fear, surged forward. The event that followed was not merely an act of violence, but a profound desecration, a horrific perversion of the very concept of spiritual cleansing. The mob, urged on by Dr. Thorne, forced their way into the Reyes home. What transpired within those adobe walls was not an exorcism, but a brutal, terrifying ritual born of fear and delusion. They believed they were purifying, but they were in fact performing a ritual of immense cruelty. Isabella, frail and unresponsive, was subjected to a horrific ordeal, a cleansing, that involved not holy water and prayers, but the torturous application of what Thorne called elemental purification. They exposed her to extremes of heat and cold, believing it would drive out the despair. They subjected her to sensory deprivation, then overwhelming stimuli, convinced it would shatter the vessel of her affliction. Her parents, Mateo and Blanca, fought desperately to protect their daughter, but they were overwhelmed, brutalized by the very people they had once called neighbors. Father Vargas, heartbroken and physically restrained, witnessed the unspeakable horror unfold, his pleas drowned out by the cries of the mob and the horrifying, animalistic sounds emanating from Isabella. He saw the gleam in Thorne's eyes, not of triumph, but of a cold intellectual satisfaction, as if he were observing a successful, albeit monstrous, experiment. Exorcism, if one could even call it that, lasted through the night, a grotesque perversion of faith, a descent into a primal, collective madness. When the sun finally rose, casting long, accusing shadows across Santa Maria de la Soledad, a terrible silence had fallen once more over the Reyes home. The mob had dispersed, their fervor replaced by a dawning, horrifying realization of what they had done. Dr. Thorne was gone, vanished as mysteriously as he had arrived, leaving behind only the profound, irreparable damage he had wrought. Inside the Rise home, Isabella lay motionless, her small, broken body a testament to the night's unspeakable brutality. Her eyes, those once sky-blue eyes, were now fixed and unseeing, devoid of even the vacantness that had become her normal state. She was truly, finally gone. Mateo and Blanca, bruised and broken, cradled their daughter's lifeless form, their grief a silent, desolate wail that tore at the heart of anyone who witnessed it. Father Vargas, his face streaked with tears and dust, performed the last rites, his voice choked with a sorrow that transcended mere loss. It was the sorrow of a shepherd who had failed his flock, of a man who had witnessed the absolute corruption of humanity. The aftermath in Santa Maria de la Soledad was a chilling testament to the enduring power of collective trauma and unspoken guilt. The villagers, now free from Thorne's direct influence, found themselves trapped in a different kind of prison, the haunting memory of their complicity. The fear that had driven them to such extreme acts now morphed into a suffocating shame. They avoided each other's gaze, their faces etched with the unspoken knowledge of the night's atrocities. The once tightly knit community dissolved into fragments of isolated families, each haunted by their own role in Isabella's final cruel ordeal. The Reyes home, once merely feared, became a symbol of their collective sin, a place they instinctively avoided, a physical embodiment of their guilt. Mateo and Blanca, their hearts shattered, buried their daughter in the small, wind-swept graveyard behind the church, not in the forgotten burial ground Thorne had favored, but on consecrated ground, a final act of defiant love and faith. They never spoke of the night's events, their silence a profound indictment of the community that had failed them. They continued to live in their adobe home, ghosts in their own lives, their days marked by a quiet, pervasive sorrow that would never truly heal. Father Vargas, now truly alone in his suffering, found himself in a spiritual wasteland. He continued to say Mass, but the words felt hollow, devoid of their former power. He saw the guilt in the eyes of his parishioners, the unspoken accusations, the profound shame, and he carried his own share of it, a heavy burden that weighed him down relentlessly. He had tried to stop it, but he had failed. He wrestled with his faith, questioning the very nature of divine intervention, of God's presence in a world where such unspeakable evil could be unleashed and left to fester. The ledger in the archive, once a record of a mysterious affliction, now became a horrifying chronicle of human depravity, a testament to how fear, manipulated by a malevolent intellect, could lead a community to commit the cruelest acts imaginable. He often found himself staring at the empty pages beyond the final entry regarding Isabella, imagining what further horrors might have been recorded if Thorn had remained, if the experiment had continued. The image of Thorn's cold intellectual satisfaction, his words about liberating the truth, played endlessly in his mind, a terrifying echo of a darkness that had found fertile ground in the heart of a desperate community. The final, unsettling revelation came to Father Vargas not through any grand theological epiphany, but through a quiet, horrifying understanding of human nature itself. He realized that the demon that had afflicted Isabella, and then the village, was perhaps not an external entity in the way he had understood it. It was a force, yes, but one that fed on despair, on fear, on ignorance, on the very human capacity for cruelty that lay dormant, waiting to be unleashed. Dr. Elias Thorne had been the catalyst, the orchestrator, the one who had artfully, meticulously, drawn out the latent darkness within the community, using Isabella as his initial, unwitting instrument. He had not brought a demon into Santa Maria de la Soledad. He had merely provided the conditions for the village's own suppressed shadows to coalesce and become manifest, a terrifying reflection of their own internal struggles and buried superstitions. The true exorcism, therefore, was not of a supernatural entity but of humanity's better angels cast out by fear and delusion. Decades passed, the world changed, wars ended, new technologies emerged, but Santa Maria de la Soledad remained largely isolated, its history unspoken, its trauma unaddressed. The original residents slowly died off, their stories taking on the air of faded legends, whispered cautiously by the few who still remembered. Isabella Reyes's gravestone, weathered by the relentless sun and wind, bore only her name and the dates of her short, tragic life. No mention of the exorcism. No hint of the horrors that had consumed her. The Reyes family line eventually died out, their adobe home slowly crumbling back into the earth, its walls carrying the silent imprint of unspeakable suffering. Father Vargas continued his lonely vigil until his death, his final years marked by a quiet, profound weariness. He never truly recovered from the events, the indelible stain of what he had witnessed etched upon his soul. He had fought a demon, yes, but the cruelest truth was that the demon had been, in part, born of the very humanity he sought to save. The last entry in the faded ledger, penned in Father Vargas's trembling hand, was not a final declaration of victory or defeat, but a haunting question, a silent lament. It spoke of the profound cost of certain battles, of victories that left only desolation, and of the enduring mystery of evil's true nature. It described the quiet, empty life of Isabella, the shattered community, and the persistent shadow that fell over Santa Maria de la Soledad, a shadow not of supernatural presence, but of human failing. The final lines of his entry, almost illegible, seemed to whisper across the decades. And so, the cruelest exorcism was not of the body but of the soul of a community, leaving behind only the dust and the silence, and the chilling truth that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. The ledger lies undisturbed in the parish archive, its terrible secret preserved in its brittle pages, a testament to a dark historical mystery, a quiet, terrifying monument to the cruelest exorcism ever recorded in U.S. church archives, not for the demonic entity it sought to banish but for the profound and irreversible damage it wrought upon the living. The wind still whispers through the parched landscape of New Mexico, and sometimes, if you listen closely, it carries a faint, desolate sigh, a memory of a child's lost innocence and a community's enduring trauma. The silence that had fallen over Santa Maria de la Soledad was not merely the absence of sound, it was a living, breathing entity, a heavy shroud woven from memory and unspoken guilt. Decades rolled on, carrying with them the last vestiges of those who had directly participated in the night of the cruelest exorcism. The children who had heard the whispers and seen the shadowy figures grew old, their own children moving away, seeking lives beyond the desert's quiet desolation. The adobe homes, once vibrant with life and the scent of baking tortillas, slowly succumbed to the elements, their walls crumbling, returning to the earth from which they had been born. The wind, relentless and unforgiving, sculpted dunes where front doors once stood, erasing the physical markers of a community consumed by its own darkest fears. Yet some things remained. The church, a stubborn testament to centuries of faith, still stood, though its bell rarely chimed now, its services attended by a handful of aging souls and occasional visitors drawn by a vague sense of history. And in its dusty archive, tucked away in a forgotten corner, the ledger lay undisturbed. Its leather cover, now almost black with age, seemed to absorb the light, its pages brittle as dried leaves. The ink, once a vibrant black, had faded to a pale sepia, but the words Father Vargas's meticulous, agonizing account remained legible. Scholars, if they ever stumbled upon it, would dismiss it as the ramblings of a zealous priest in a forgotten corner of the world, a curiosity of local superstition. But anyone who truly read it, who allowed the somber intelligence of Vargas's prose to seep into their consciousness, would feel the profound chill of a horror far more insidious than any monster. The legacy of Santa Maria de la Soledad was not one of a spectral haunting in the traditional sense, but a more profound psychological one. It was the haunting of memory, of unprocessed trauma passed down through generations not by explicit stories but by a pervasive unease, a deep-seated distrust of outsiders and a quiet, almost genetic melancholy. The children of those who had witnessed Isabella's final torment carried an unspoken burden, a sensitivity to the subtle shifts in the air, a wariness of inexplicable events. They learned to keep their thoughts to themselves, to avoid confrontation, to endure in silence. The land itself seemed to remember, the ancient spirits Thorn had invoked, or perhaps merely symbolized, seemed to linger, not as malevolent entities, but as a perpetual echo of the human failing that had opened the door to such profound suffering. The occasional traveler, lost or curious, might still stumble upon the fading remnants of Santa Maria de la Soledad. They might notice the strange quiet that hung over the place, the way the wind seemed to whisper secrets they couldn't quite decipher. They might feel a prickling sensation on their skin, a sense of being watched, not by eyes but by the weight of unspoken history. Perhaps, if they ventured closer to the crumbling Ray's home, they might hear the faint, almost imperceptible sound of a child's sob carried on the desert breeze, or see a fleeting shadow dart across their peripheral vision, a trick of the light and the dust. But the true horror wasn't in these fleeting phenomena. It lay in the enduring silence that enveloped the place. A silence far more terrifying than any scream. It was the silence of a truth too painful to speak, of a wound too deep to heal. It was the silence of a community that had cannibalized its own innocence, driven by fear and manipulated by a cold, calculating intellect. The cruelest exorcism had indeed recorded itself, not just in the dusty pages of a forgotten ledger, but in the very soul of Santa Maria de la Soledad, leaving behind a profound and permanent emptiness. The land remembered. The wind remembered. And in the vast, indifferent expanse of the New Mexico desert, the truth, stripped bare of all supernatural embellishment, was arguably far more terrifying than any demon. The most enduring horrors are often those we inflict upon ourselves, leaving behind a silence that screams louder than any nightmare.